Welcome to the Coptimizer Podcast, a platform dedicated to uncuffing your true potential in public safety. We're here to provide you with valuable tips and insights that will help you optimize your life and career. I'm retired Chief Patrick Flannelly, and I am honored to be your guide on this journey. Here, I'll share the latest insights and strategies to help you survive and thrive in the demanding world of public safety. Join us as we explore cutting-edge research, interview top experts, and share inspiring stories of transformation. Whether you are on duty or off, it's time to optimize your potential and live your best life. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered. This is the Coptimizer Podcast, and it's time to hit the street. Greetings all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer Podcast. I'm your host, retired Chief of Police Patrick Flannelly. Today I'm really excited. We've got a special guest. We have Gary Taubes, a New York Times bestselling author. And more importantly, in terms of his title for today's conversation, I really want to focus on Gary's background as a scientific investigative journalist. Gary's groundbreaking work on nutrition and health has challenged conventional wisdom and sparked important conversations about obesity, weight loss, metabolic health, and the veracity of the information that we receive on a daily basis. So I want you to join us today as we explore some of these critical topics and their impact on law enforcement and us as individual first responders. As we get rolling here in a second, I kind of want to set the stage and go back to 2015. My good friend, Dr. Jim Greenwald from Specialty Health, aka Greenie, he joined us on this conversation as well. Greenie started a program with the Reno Police Department with Chief Steve Pitts back in the early 2010 timeframe, which eventually featured in IACP magazine and was one of the top wellness awards, I think in 2013 for their program Resiliency as a Path to Wellness. So Greenie's got a great background, and his venture into this space is also pretty interesting as an orthopedic doctor, but we kind of had this convergence in 2015 when I was looking to run a program where I would do some lab testing and look at things that might actually help improve fitness and obesity and metabolic health. And I was just having a hard time finding anyone that would do it, quite frankly, in the intro to Greenie. So it really kind of started a special relationship, and that testing that we did with Specialty Health back in 2015 eventually evolved into a program that we call The Blood Doesn't Lie. And that's something that we can bring to any police department anywhere in America. Just hit me up if you want to learn more about it. But what we were looking to do was focus on metabolic health and insulin resistance in law enforcement. And despite our best efforts, the problem is not getting any better. In fact, it's gotten worse. And I say that because if you've been listening to the show, go back and listen to the episode with Jonette Van Deen if you haven't listened to it already. But Jonette's story is not unique. She was a type 2 diabetic, or is a type 2 diabetic, had gained a lot of weight and had struggled for years on the best ways to lose weight and to get healthy. And we talk a lot about her journey, but the big takeaway from that conversation with me as a leader was being a little bit disappointed in myself that despite the best efforts that I've made in teaching these classes, all the way going back to the late 90s in terms of diet, nutrition, and exercise and metabolic health as a whole, adrenal stress, all the things that police officers face, the message just isn't getting to our officers, our dispatchers, and all of our employees. And so we've got to do a better job. And I think again, that's where Gary and people like Gary come in, because uh, he not only has he written multiple books that I'll touch on in a minute, but he takes that approach that what works and what doesn't work, what are the facts, and let's separate the facts from fiction. So again, if you think about that, the takeaway from this conversation is the importance of becoming your own health detective. Use your investigative skills that you've been trained on, that you've developed from your years of experience on the job, to scrutinize the information that you receive about health and wellness. Because in the world of Instagram and Snapchat and the internet in general, there is no shortage of people out there that are willing, eager, and excited to share their information with you. And that's not a bad thing. The dangerous thing is that what works for one person might not work for another, and the motivations behind why people do this is really what I want people to think about as well. Does somebody really have my best interest in mind, or are they just trying to sell a program? Um, you know, there can be some great information out there, but you've got to take that investigator's hat and apply it to what you're reading, and not believe the things that you want to believe because maybe they're convenient or they align with the things that you like, but find the things that are evidence-based, that have the scientific background, the rigors through imperial study that show that this works and that this doesn't work. Just don't accept the first thing that you hear. Look for these facts and the motives behind the information. And I think Gary is a great example of somebody that does that and does it extremely well. And I think as police officers, we should really kind of embrace that concept. So just to touch on some of his work, if you're not familiar with him, uh, I would be surprised. And so I had a little bit of fanboy syndrome in this interview, because I've been reading his work since his book "Good Calories, Bad Calories" came out over 20 years ago. And then the follow-up book that he wrote to that is "Why We Get Fat," which you can see right here. This is one of the most recommended books that I give out to people. Good Calories, Bad Calories is good also, but I think this one I think gets into the questions about why a little bit more. And so if you're interested and you haven't read his work, I really encourage you to do so. And then also, once you do that, I think some of his follow-up books will make a lot more sense to you. He's written this book, The Case Against Sugar, which is fantastic. He wrote a book called The Case for Keto, which I've given that copy away. And then most recently, his book Rethinking Diabetes, and I think what science reveals about diet, insulin, and successful treatments. The title really says it all. But there's, Greenie and I, in our program, The Blood Doesn't Lie, we focus on 11 pages in here in the back of the book that really align, that kind of synthesize everything that we've been talking about for the last 10 years, as we try to get people to adapt this approach at looking inside first at the blood, in having an understanding about what works for you and what doesn't work. Again, the yeah, these books are fantastic. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Um, the program that has evolved from this continues to evolve. We've presented at the IACP Wellness Symposium. We've presented to the National FOP Wellness Symposium. We've taught this class at smaller conferences and classes around the country. One that comes to mind is the Transform Law Enforcement Conference in Kentucky with Chief Joe Monroe. I think he does a fantastic job. And I was on site last year and interviewed Chief Monroe, so you can go back to last year's episodes and find that one. But as we jump into this conversation, here's some things I want you to think about. Despite all the progress that we've made in health and wellness, and some of the investments really in the last decade that are starting to be made for first responders to understand some of these negative outcomes, the problem isn't getting better, it's getting worse. Almost 80% of police officers are overweight. 40% of those being obese and 20% being morbidly obese. And those numbers are rising. Cardiovascular disease is by far the number one killer of cops every year. And second place is not even close. And that is most likely suicide. And again, another challenging thing about making bold claims like that is that the problem is likely worse than we think it is. We just don't have good data to collect it because not every state collects data in the same way. Suicide and tracking deaths by suicide in law enforcement is getting better, thankfully, but it's a big problem. What do all these things about obesity, overweight, morbid obesity, what do they all have in common? They all stem from insulin resistance, which is the precursor to type 2 diabetes. Way too many cops are suffering from these preventable illnesses and a lot of maladies that are a byproduct of insulin resistance. So we've got an interesting follow-up interview coming next week with Dr. Lauren Fulkerson, so stay tuned for that one. But there we're going to touch on where not only do these pathways for healthy metabolic conditions improve our overall wellness and our fitness, but there's also a huge component for our mental well-being as well. And we're going to touch on that in the next episode. But for today, with this episode, I got, again, like I said, had a little bit of a fanboy moment going on, and I got into the conversation and forgot to hit start on the record button. But I caught it, and so you'll hear us jump right in to why it's really where Gary's explaining why you should listen to him as a scientific investigative journalist. And for those that, if I say journalist, we conjure up a lot of different thoughts in our mind about what that might be. But the scientific investigative journalists, the ones that are diving in and looking at the study and doing the analysis of the data and the information and seeking the truth, is really something that we as police officers and as first responders should really embrace. And I think Gary does a fantastic job. And it's one of the reasons why I've been such a huge fan of his work. And then I just really grateful that he would spend some of his valuable time with us and talk about why this is so important. So without further ado, I'm gonna jump right into this conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learned something from it.
A science journalist who had written books about people who had discovered, like, really, really smart people who had screwed up their science and discovered non-existent phenomena, and which is embarrassing, when you claim something exists and it turns out you're wrong, and you have to discover, ideally you discover you're wrong, but often it's your competitors point out to you how you screwed up, and then you have to live with it for the rest of your life. And in some fields, you never get over that taint. Like, you discover a non-existent phenomena, that's it for your credibility forever. But in nutrition and public health, you're dealing with these fields where you can't really test your hypotheses. They're very hard. So you get this hypothesis that, for instance, saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol, gives you heart disease, and it's surprisingly hard to test. So because it takes 10, 20, 30 years to develop heart disease, you got to start with people who are relatively healthy, and then you got to randomize half of them to eat a high saturated fat diet and the other half to eat a low saturated fat diet. And you got to run it out for 30 years and 10 years, 20 years, see what happens. A long time for people to stay on whatever diet you've told them to eat. So there's all kinds of problems with the tests, and they tend to cost tens of millions of dollars. So as an investigative science journalist interested in this question of how to do science right, in the 90s, some of my friends in the physics community pointed me to public health, and they said, you should look at that stuff. It's terrible. And it turned out it was. And from public health, and by being terrible, it means because these people couldn't test their hypotheses, they decided that the tests weren't really necessary to believe what they thought was true. So science is hypothesis and test, if nothing else. And in fields like public health, it's so hard to test the hypotheses rather than sort of couch their advice, sort of a lot of caveats, like we think you should eat a low fat diet, or we think you should avoid salt, or we think you should eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. Because if you couch it like that and you say, we don't know if we're right or not, but we think this is good advice, people don't listen to you. So they would give you firm advice and just sort of drop this idea that the hypotheses have to be tested. So in the late 90s, when I sort of drifted into nutrition, I realized that a lot of what we believe about the nature of a healthy diet, this is what you were disseminating in the late 90s and what I believed, had never really been tested. And when it had been tested, it had failed the tests. So like the most expensive diet trial ever done was in women. It was called the Women's Health Initiative, and it was a $500 million study. And they tested this idea that we should eat like lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and we should avoid fatty meats and kind of red meat in general. And they had 49,000 women in this trial, and 20,000 of them were randomized to this healthy diet, and they ran it out for like 7 years, and it had no benefits. Like the women saw no benefits from eating the way we've been told to eat. And they responded by saying, well, yeah, it's true the trial failed to confirm what we believe, but you should just do it anyway, because this is still what we believe is true. And as a journalist or an investigative journalist, this is kind of what I stumbled into. And I started looking at the history and the research and what you find when you do that is pretty frightening. And this is the series of books I've written, beginning with Good Calories, Bad Calories in 2007. So ideally, our public health authorities would do that. Like what you said about 40% of policemen are obese and 20% are morbidly obese.
Yeah, 80% are overweight. Yeah, 40% obese, 20%. And that number is actually probably higher now because the data is a little old.
Yeah, and that's on one level, that's crazy. So if you were like a corporation and you were charged with keeping, our police forces healthy, and over the course of 30 years, you ended up with obesity numbers like this, the board of the corporation would say, wait a minute, there's something really wrong here, right? I mean, maybe this is the best we could do, but maybe you guys are doing it. Can I use scatological terms on the show?
Yeah, sure. Whatever you want.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you guys are doing a shitty job of it. Like maybe you don't know what you're doing. And the corporation would then hire consultants. Like when I was growing up, it was always McKinsey. McKinsey would come in and they would go through all the records and rip the place to shreds figuratively. And at the end of it, they would say, well, look, you're doing this, and this wrong. And these people have to be fired. And we have to replace these people. And we have to rethink this and rethink that. And this approach is a failure.
And by the way, we're willing to help you with that process.
Yeah. So the problem is in public health organizations like the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, they have no mechanisms to do that. So no matter how bad things get, no matter how obese and diabetic the population gets, there's no mechanism by which the National Institutes of Health or the American Heart Association can stop and say, wait a minute, let's bring in McKinsey and see whether we're doing something wrong. So the job ends up getting left to basically people like me, journalists. And now you've got influencers on social media. And the world is full of sort of people who try to do this here. Yeah. So it's sort of
journalist. Yeah.
And the flip side of all this, so you've got the public health advice. So the obesity and diabetes epidemic sort of exploded simultaneously with us giving the advice that we should eat low-fat diets and get 50% of our calories from carbs and whole grains and fruits and vegetables and all these things we believe unconditionally. So why we start giving that advice, the nation gets fatter and fatter and more diabetic, and nobody stops to say, is this right? They just assume that somehow the people aren't paying it. Like we have an image of why are policemen fat and obese? Well, they're sitting in their cars all day long eating donuts.
Right.
So they're not working out. They're not eating right. They're not eating their fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and legumes. And, they're not listening to us. So we could always blame the population. And then, so like I said, people like me come along, and I had a good record as a journalist. I was considered one of the best investigative science journalists, maybe one of 3 investigative science journalists in the country. I was the only print journalist to win this one major award 3 times, and the articles I wrote won awards. And I just said, look, maybe you screwed up. Let me play the McKinsey role here.
Yeah.
And
Well,
step in and see if I can make sense of it. And when you do that, you turn out that there's been this screw ups are pretty obvious if you actually go and look without preconceptions. It doesn't mean that what I'm saying isn't a screw up, because I could fuck up too, clearly. But there was always a sort of alternative hypothesis. So in the 60s and 70s, we latched onto this idea that dietary fat's a problem and saturated fat's a problem. And because there's a lot of saturated fat in animal products and meat and dairy, we should eat fruits and vegetables and whole grains instead of, these animal-based foods. And that was good for the environment. It was ethically, it's all great. And like I said, the problem is if you just look objectively at what's happened since we embraced that thinking, we have these obesity and diabetes epidemics. So,
yeah.
And the flip side is people like Greeny. Okay. You put people on diets that restrict carbs instead of fats, and they get healthy. And that's all you have to know. Right? Now you've got clinical experience. If I get a patient comes in, they're 100 pounds overweight, morbidly obese, and I could get them to stop eating grains and sweets and starchy vegetables, they can eat anything else they want. They get healthy. They just do. And then there's probably 200 clinical trials at this point supporting that argument.
Greeny,
I mean,
but that went back to you, and where it seemed to me you made a giant leap was in 2002 when you wrote, "What if it's all been a big fat lie?" And you asked the American Medical Association to apologize. Naked in Times Square.
it's sort of.
And you talked about the problem with triglycerides, not cholesterol, triglycerides. You were sounding just like Gerald Reaven.
Well, because I had read Reaven's work.
Go ahead.
Okay, so back to my history, since I do these 2 investigative articles for the journal Science. I get into nutrition asking this question: does salt cause hypertension? Should we all be restricting the salt in our diets? Turns out there's always been a very vitriolic controversy about this, even though it's just considered obvious. It's consensus nutritional wisdom. When you actually look at the evidence, it's surprisingly sparse and inconsistent. And so I did an investigation on that for the journal Science. I spent 9 months on that, interviewed 80 odd people, read all the literature. Not only read all the literature, I found researchers whom I respected who hadn't been involved in this, and I had them read the literature for me, like stacks of articles a foot deep. And turned out that very little evidence for this idea we should restrict the salt content of our diet to lower our blood pressure and reduce the risk of stroke and heart disease. And that got me into this dietary fat story, the saturated fat and cholesterol. And then I did this story for the New York Times Magazine that I was going to try and establish what was the likely cause of the obesity epidemic. This was 2001. The epidemic was relatively new then, and we only really knew about it since 97. And in the course of doing this research, there were clinical trials that had been done of people testing the Atkins diet. So the idea is, they hadn't been published yet. So I was the first one to get to really write about them. But we had two belief systems in the 1990s that seemed incontrovertible. So you get heart disease because of the saturated fat in your diet, and you get fat because you eat too much. So we now have an obesity epidemic. Doctors are confronted with more and more patients in their waiting rooms who are obese. And so these doctors, occasionally one of the patients would go on the Atkins diet himself. That was what we call keto today. So Atkins was, you eat a lot of, basically you're living on eggs and meat, fatty meat and fish and green vegetables and lots of butter, and you can eat as much as you want. And these doctors do clinical trials testing the Atkins diet against the American Heart Association advice. So this is how I looked at it, which I like to think is how a scientist would look at it. You have one diet where you get to eat as much as you want and eat as much saturated fat as you want. And you're comparing it to a diet where you're getting a low-fat diet and you're restricting calories. And you've got these two belief systems that say if you get to eat as much as you want, you're going to get fatter. And if you get to eat as much saturated fat as you want, your heart disease, you're going to have heart disease. I mean, back then we all assumed that if you ate Atkins, you would die of a heart attack within an hour and a half after your first, eggs and bacon meal.
Yeah.
All 5 of these clinical trials, all done by doctors who had patients who tried Atkins and seemed to get healthy. All 5 of the clinical trials showed that Atkins did better than the American Heart Association diet. Not just that people lost more weight, so you get to eat as much as you want, but you lose more weight than if you calorie restrict, and you get to eat as much saturated fat as you want. You're eating all these saturated fat-rich foods, supposedly clog our arteries, but your heart disease risk factors get healthier, and those heart disease risk factors include most prominently triglycerides, but also blood sugar, insulin. Blood pressure comes down when you eat this way, even though you don't have to restrict salt consumption. So, as a journalist, I was like, well, wait a minute. So what you're telling me is if you don't eat carbs, you can eat as much fat as you want, and you can eat as many calories as you want, and you lose weight and your heart disease risk factors come down. That's kind of remarkable. In science, they call it an anomalous observation. It's actually 2 anomalous observations. The whole field should put the brakes on and say, wait a minute, maybe our advice is wrong. Let's rethink this. And of course, I wrote this article. It's the most controversial cover story the New York Times Magazine ever ran up until then, and maybe since. And I get pilloried, of course, in the media and by even friends in journalism who accuse me of basically selling out to get a big book deal, which I got. But the point is, when you actually test these hypotheses, and there's remember, science is hypothesis and test. If you actually test this idea that saturated fat causes heart disease by feeding people saturated fat-rich diets, the hypothesis fails to test. And if you test this idea that the only way to lose weight is to eat less, and you give people these diets where you get to eat as much as you want and they lose weight, that seems to refute that hypothesis. So that was the basis of that New York Times Magazine story. The cover was a ribeye, like a pat of butter on it. And as the editor, who became a friend, told me, they picked the photo of the ribeye that made it look like as greasy and heart clogging. as humanly possible. Then I got 5 years to do this book, which allowed me to do more research than I've ever done. And, and in that research, what you learn is people like Gerald Reaven and the concept of metabolic syndrome was a sort of alternative hypothesis of heart disease. So one idea is we get heart disease, we clog our arteries because we eat saturated fat, which makes our LDL cholesterol goes up, which causes atherosclerosis. And that's what we believe since the mid 1980s. We're not allowed to not believe it. And because statins kind of work in some populations, they prevent heart attacks, and statins also lower LDL cholesterol. This was seen as proof of the hypothesis. And the other hypothesis is that we get heart disease because we become insulin resistant. This is Gerald Reaven's hypothesis. And when we're insulin resistant, we have high blood sugar, we have high insulin levels, we have high triglycerides, we have low HDL cholesterol, we've got high blood pressure. Did I mention that? We're getting fatter. It's a sign of insulin resistance. And if you want to fix the insulin resistance, you don't do it by limiting the saturated fat in your diet. You do it by getting rid of the carbohydrates you're eating. Just basically what Atkins was saying and what keto does. And when you test that hypothesis in clinical trials, people get healthier. Everything improves, except the joke being LDL cholesterol. And we could talk about that.
Yeah, and for our audience, which is primarily first responders, police officers, your summary there is, I probably bought your book, I think, when it sat right on the end because on the end cap. And I'll just tell you a quick story, just kind of it's some of this for Greeny too. But when I did that first wellness presentation for our police department back in the late 90s, it was like 98, 99 timeframe. It was because I was lucky. I stumbled onto some information out of sheer necessity, meaning I was trying out for our SWAT team. So I was trying to maximize my score on my fitness test. So I bought, and I bought this book that was written by a marathon runner because in the 90s, right? If you're looking for who are the healthiest, fittest people around, well, it's marathon runners or it's triathletes. Right. So I'm like, well, let me do what they're doing. I wasn't in bad shape. I was lifting weights and running on my own. So I bought this book and it recommended 60% of my calories come from carbohydrates, 25% from fat, 15% from protein. I started this diet. I'm working the midnight shift. And within a couple of weeks, I would generally go to bed around 9 in the morning, and I was waking up around noon, just famished, like starving, hungry. And I was like, oh my God, I'm a disciplined person, so I don't want to snack or anything. I want to follow the plan. Well, I can't. I got to eat something or else I can't fall back asleep. So I start eating these snacks and then I would wake up feeling guilty and tired. And then I'd go to my evening workout, go to work. But anyway, there's a Starbucks opened up inside of Barnes and Noble, less than a mile from my house. So on some of those days where I couldn't get back to sleep, I would just wander down to the bookstore, buy a big cup of coffee, look for whatever I was going to read next. And there was one day, just pick up a book and open it up. And I just happened to open up to a page where in the paraphrase, it was, hey, if you're waking up hungry or you're having trouble falling asleep, you should really look at what you're eating before you go to bed. And it was Barry Sears's book, The Zone Diet. And I was like, wow, this is really weird. I'm here because I've woken up. I can't fall back asleep. I'm tired. And I read that book. Like I sat there and read, I skipped my evening workout. I went to work that night, dodged as many calls as I could. I just kept reading. The next morning I went home. I bought a dozen eggs at the grocery store, some vegetables, some lunch meat, some cheese. And I go home, I make this big omelet. And I eat this omelet, I go to bed, and I slept that day like I hadn't slept in forever. I mean, I slept like a baby. I woke up, I felt like a new person. And, so then I was like the guy who found Jesus. I was, over the course of the next few months, my push-ups, my sit-ups, my physical performance just went through the roof. And the only thing I did was start eating in these zone blocks. And I'm not going to go into the zone block stuff. I know you understand it, but I was literally running around this is your book, but one of your books anyway. You got to read this book. And what it taught me was that, wow, here I am reading what the experts are recommending. And these are all the things that the American Heart Association was following, these heart healthy things. So here was my breakfast. It was a big bowl of Wheaties with some skim milk, sprinkle a little granola on it. And if I wanted a treat, I would slice a banana on it, right? Because that was about the perfect ratio. And who doesn't like a bowl of Wheaties, right? It tasted really good, but it was just wrecking my sleep. So,
well, there are two issues that come up with your story that I wanted. So one of them is, because it's funny, marathon runners played a massive role in all this, because people who run marathons tend to be like small and slight, like the good ones, right? They don't start off 300 pounds and then chisel themselves down to 5'7" and 130 by running. They start off 5'7" and 130. And this is why they're so good, because they're light on their feet. They're not destroying their joints by running, and they metabolize carbs into fuel. And so back in the 50s and 60s, one of the breakthroughs in nutrition training for endurance athletes was carb loading. And the joke is, this was pioneered by Scandinavians who were interested in cross-country skiing, which is incredibly difficult to do for long distances. And they would train these people all year long on basically carb-restricted diets, and then they would carb load them beginning the day before the race. But by the time that percolated to the US and other athletes, it became carb loading all the time. And then we look at marathon runners and we think, I want to be able to run marathons. I spend my whole adult life trying to run more than 6 miles without my knees failing me. And I thought if I just did it enough, I would go from being like a hippopotamus to a gazelle. And you never actually make that transition, because the people who run marathons are different than those of us who grow up to be, like in my case, Division II defensive tackle in football back in the 70s, when you could be a defensive tackle and weigh 240 pounds instead of 290 today. We're just different. So that's one of the ideas. People who gain weight, who struggle with their weight, are different than people who don't. And if folks like me are right, the major differences in their ability to metabolize carbohydrates, like people with diabetes cannot metabolize carbohydrates safely, whereas people without diabetes can. And the idea is people who tend to gain weight easily, the problem is also the carbohydrate content of the diet, insulin and insulin resistance. And then the second issue is the zone. Barry Sears is the zone, massive bestseller in the 90s. Sears kind of understood this science, in part because he was good friends with Mary Dan and Mike Eads, who did understand this. They wrote Protein Power. So if you actually read his book carefully, all the advice he's giving is about lowering insulin. I mean, he talks about all these effects of, I forget the
icosanoids.
Yeah, icosanoids. And it's like, but bad icosanoids happen when insulin is high, and good icosanoids happen when insulin is low, and everything is aimed at lowering insulin levels. But then he ends up recommending 40% of the calories from carbs, good carbs, so slow, fiber-rich carbohydrates.
Yep.
And I heard the reason he did this indirectly is because he was making zone bars, and it was hard to make a bar that stayed together without 40% carbs. So he made 40% carbs his target. I'm hoping, Barry, that I'm not doing you a disservice here. But the point is, everything ultimately was about lowering insulin. And the fewer carbs you eat, the lower your insulin will be. So you end up with a book that the advice works, but it would work a lot better for a lot more people if he didn't stop at 40% carbs and took it all the way down to, as low as you could go, which is basically what keto and Atkins was doing.
I always wondered if he did that, like if he just tried to like shoot for a middle ground, because if he went more, and I don't know, this is just me speculating, if he went more towards the Atkins, because Atkins, yeah, at that time was so, yeah, it was so
Vilified is the
oh my
word you're
God, it
looking
was like,
for. Yeah.
it's like you're going out and killing people if you tell people that they should eat the Atkins diet, like,
Well, that's the thing. So on some level, you're probably right. And Atkins had already staked out the high fat, low carb ground. And one of the problems with diet doctors in general is they always have to say something new, or why write the book? So, it's interesting because as a journalist, I could come along and just talk about all these different approaches. I could even say what I think is right and what I think is wrong. And I can interview all these people and ask them, why did you do this? And I could criticize them all. But when you're just a doctor writing a book, pushing your own proposal, it's pretty much got to be different from everyone else's. So some of them do it by going a little more this way or focus, like you see it today with their people who recommend very low carb diets for their patients and say they do it because they want protein to be high. And the key is that high protein inhibits your appetite. And then there are people who recommend very low carb diets for their patients and say the reason low carb works is because you're not eating seed oils. And the seed oils are the key. So you got books saying seed oils are the problem, eat a low carb diet. You got books saying low protein is the problem, eat a low carb diet. You had Sears basically saying, yeah, you got to eat, you got to get the zone, you got to be in the zone, eat a low carb diet. And then I could come along as a journalist and say, the one thing we could trust, and which has now been tested, like I said, in several hundred clinical trials, is when you remove these carbs from the diet. And I'll throw this in, eat real food.
yeah.
So you're getting, you're not eating processed shit from the middle aisles of the supermarket. Then you get healthier, which seems to suggest that the carbs are the problem.
So yeah, and in your, and in, just for the audience, I'm sure most are familiar with your books and what you've written, but maybe for those that aren't, good calories, bad calories, and then why we get fat, which kind of I think that was a great follow-up, because it explained, I think, the science in just a much more easily digestible way for the lay person.
That was airplane reading. It was written to be airplane reading.
And it was fantastic. And then where I kind of wanted to get to next, because and I don't know if you wrote one in between there or not, but the case against sugar, why we get fat. You have got a line in your opening that I just love, because it really just kind of talks about, Greenie and I have talked about this a lot when we settled on the blood doesn't lie. When you're trying to get people to adopt lifestyle changes, specifically when it comes to nutrition, if you're trying to motivate them, then perhaps you can show them some evidence about what works and what doesn't. And what better way to do that than to take their blood out of their own body and run it through an NMR and show them, hey, here are 7 lines of data that are pretty predictive of your health, particularly for the next 10 years, and whether you're going to suffer from cardiovascular disease or not, or here's what your risk factors are. Well, even then, sometimes it's hard to get people to believe it. So we just like the idea of, well, we're cops. At least we're supposed to be investigators. We're supposed to be truth seekers. We're supposed to find the evidence for what is, what works, what doesn't work. And you in your book, Rethinking Diabetes, you note in there, like, if you were to compare a country's approach to controlling diabetes, and I'll say, like, in the same way that we're going to approach crime, that might give us a little bit of perspective for, maybe helping first responders. Law enforcement officers have to give some consideration to what their own personal approach is going to be. The American Diabetes Association, refers to diet. I think that's what you said, as a temporary way to eat, something you can do off and on, using medical nutrition therapies and others to, to help with diabetes and diabetes control. It's kind of like, and the way I liken it was like, well, I guess if we approach crime this way, like if crime goes up, we go arrest people and throw them in jail. And then after they've been in jail for a while, crime goes down, and then we let them back out. And then crime goes back up again, and then we arrest them, and then we put them back in jail, and we get into these cycles. Like, does that really make sense as a crime control strategy? So from a diet perspective, if you go on this diet and it does or doesn't work, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just blabbering here now.
Well, this is no, but it's, again, you're making an important point here, because the way we've been sort of indoctrinated to think about this is there's sort of conventional wisdom where there are good foods, or like you hear this phrase, food is medicine. So healthy foods are fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes and like maybe fish with, and they don't talk about unhealthy foods. They don't want you to eat white, refined, highly ultra processed foods are now, the bogeyman. But the idea is if you eat that way, that's going to keep you healthy or make you healthy. And like I said, the horrible joke there is that when those hypotheses have been tested, by a hypothesis, I mean the idea that these will make you healthy or fix what's wrong with you, they tend to fail the test. And if you're not doing that, you're on a diet. And then there are all these named diets. So the authorities will talk about diet book doctors and fad diets. And fad diets is basically anything that isn't the conventional thinking, except that the conventional thinking has failed. So if you've spent your whole life trying to be lean, for instance, and you've done, like, we all went through the same thought, experience you did on some level. We all ate exactly the way we were supposed to eat and got fatter anyway. And I suspect if I was checking my blood sugar in the 90s, I would have learned that I was getting insulin resistant and maybe moving towards diabetes as I was eating this. I lived in Los Angeles. I mean, it's crazy how healthy my diet was, low in fat, fruits, vegetables, whole grains. I mean, I joked in the 90s that I boiled 10,000 eggs and threw out 10,000 yolks because yolks had to, So you eat that way, you get sick of and the alternative is going on a diet, and then the authorities will say, well, you can't stick to a diet. And like I said, here's sort of one of the advantages I had in the journalism, and as a journalist, and one of the books you left out is a book I wrote called The Case for Keto, where I made the simple point that if carbohydrates are the problem, which is one, like, to look at your experience, you were sleeping badly until you got rid of the crap carbs in your diet. You basically replaced the Wheaties with eggs and green vegetables and butter, and then you slept well. And we can be pretty confident that if you switched back, you would sleep poorly again, which would argue that it's those carbs that caused your sleep problems. So the other way to think about a ketogenic diet is just don't eat the damn carbohydrates because they're making you sick. And then the question is, can people adhere to a diet that says don't eat these foods because you make you sick? Like, I don't know about policemen today, but when I was growing up, we all smoked cigarettes. And then we learned that the cigarettes were going to kill us, and most of us stopped smoking. And it was a miserable process to do it. And we were unhappy as hell. And a lot of us lost friends during the months that we were going through withdrawal.
Yeah.
But we didn't say, hey, nobody can adhere to a smoking cessation program, therefore cigarettes don't cause lung cancer. we would try to quit, fail, try to quit, fail, try to quit, fail, and eventually we would succeed. And we would become non-smokers, who not only are non-smokers, we could not imagine ever smoking a cigarette again. Like the same way I can't imagine when I was in the 90s, I used to start each morning with fresh squeezed orange juice. That was like my luxury breakfast drink.
Yeah.
Couldn't just buy concentrate or the cartons. I had to get it fresh squeezed from the supermarket, and I couldn't imagine starting my morning without it. And now, 25 years later, I can't imagine drinking orange juice any more than I could imagine smoking a cigarette. It's just something I got over because it was making me sick, even though it was full of vitamin C or whatever nonsense I was being
So
told.
healthy. So healthy.
It's so healthy. So you're not going on a diet. You're just identifying the foods that make you sick, and then you're not eating them. And everything else is fine.
Make the case.
I mean, it's true that among the foods you can't eat are donuts. That's a pain in the ass. But eventually you get to the point. I mean, I used to love smoking cigarettes. I used to live to my next cigarette. Basically that's the joy of having an addiction, is that it gives you something to look forward to, which is the next time you get to smoke or shoot up or have a drink and then you quit and you get over it.
Yeah, they're all working on the same pathways, right? I mean, that's
well, pathways
similar.
may be subtly different. I think there's some liver stuff going on with the foods that probably aren't going on with the drugs, but you never know. But anyway, that's the issue. So you see the doctor and you say, I think I'm going to try this keto stuff because all these clinical trials, they say, oh, nobody can adhere to that. And you say, what's the problem with adhering to not eating pasta or potatoes? Are you telling me these foods are so what that I just can't not eat them? Actually, let me tell you a story from the diabetes book, which is my latest book, Rethinking Diabetes. And again, I'm asking this question. Diabetes is a disease of where the primary symptom is like that primary characteristic is you can't metabolize the carbohydrates in your diet without pharmaceutical help. And yet, since 1971, the American Diabetes Association is saying that diabetics in particular should get more than 50% of their calories from the one macronutrient they can't metabolize without pharmaceutical help. And I'm one of the few people in the country who don't think they said that because the pharmaceutical industry was paying them to set up a situation in which you had to take drugs. But the other way, so there are two ways to handle diabetes. You can keep your blood sugar under control with drugs. And if you get symptoms like high blood pressure, or you're getting fatter, or your LDL cholesterol is going on, whatever it is, we got drugs for those also. We got dialysis for when your kidney fails, and we could amputate your limbs when you get gangrene. And we got amazing eye surgery stuff we could do if you start getting retinopathies and go blind. But you should still get 50% of your calories from carbs, and we'll use drugs and devices and surgery to solve all the problems we can't solve. And the alternative is don't eat the carbs. Okay? So if you don't eat the carbs, you're fine. As far as we can tell from the clinical trials that have been done, if you don't eat the carbs, you don't manifest the diabetes. And so all these other long-term consequences of living with this disease seem to be prevented, delayed, maybe prevented entirely if you just don't eat the carbs. So if you're diagnosed with diabetes and those were the choices you were given, you could get 50% of your calories from carbs because that'll keep fat low, which will lower your LDL cholesterol, which we think will help prevent heart disease. But since you're at high risk of heart disease anyway, we're going to give you statins and we're going to give you blood pressure lowering medications because your blood pressure is going to go up and you're going to have to take insulin, which is going to make you fatter. But we now have drugs for that called GLP-1 agonists. we got you covered. And like I said, if you get gangrene, we could amputate. And if your kidney fails, we got dialysis. And if you go blind, well, we can't replace your eyes yet, but we're working on it. Or don't eat the carbs.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with excess weight or obesity. I mean, it increases your risk of every chronic disease, including diabetes, or you cannot eat the carbs if we're right. And the easiest way to find out is you can experiment. You can test it on yourself. You don't need a clinical trial to tell you whether not eating the carbs solves your problem. And I think that people who become police, who have the willpower and social consciousness and courage to do that job, which none of the rest of us do, will also be able to not eat the carbs if it makes them healthy. How difficult is that?
And there's, and that's, if you forget everything else that we talk about today, just think about that right there. Like you don't need a clinical study. You don't need to read 10 books on how to perfect it, right? Don't let great be the enemy of good. Just start by doing exactly what you said. Start eliminating the carbs. And oh, by the way, the easiest way to do that is not to drink your calories. So, don't drink the orange juice. If you want some orange, drink a glass of water and eat a half an orange or eat an orange. Don't drink your orange juice.
Well, so here's where keto and Atkins come in handy, because so not eating the carbs, I mean, I made it sound easy. And for a diabetic, person with diabetes, it should be easy. But for the rest of us who aren't, confronted with this debate between should I shoot up with insulin or not eat carbs, when we eat carbs, our bodies preferentially burn carbs. I think they do it because high blood sugar is toxic and the body is working its ass off to keep blood sugar low. So it does that by preferentially burning carbs for fuel and storing everything else we eat, fat and fat cells, which is why you get fatter, and you use the protein for rebuilding tissues and cells and organs. So when you don't eat the carbs, you're starving your body of fuel because it's used to burning fuel for carbs. That's one reason why you eat every couple of hours, right? Is because you can't store a lot of carbs. So you're constantly got to replenish. And so you're constantly snacking. You eat breakfast, your high carb breakfast, and you've got the donut an hour later, then you have a Coca-Cola, then you eat lunch with the Coca-Cola, then you have a midday snack, then you fight like hell not to fall asleep in the cruiser in the middle of the afternoon. Yeah. And then you finally get to the point where you could have your beer, which is liquid carbs, and your dinner, and then a snack afterwards, and your content. If you replace the carbs with fat, which is basically what you're doing with keto, so now you're eating these foods that you've been told will kill you. So you're having fatty meat and eggs with the yolks and cheese and butter and olive oil, and then your body switches over the course of a couple of weeks to burning the fat for fuel instead of carbs. Now you're not hungry, you're not craving the carbs. You can eat breakfast and easily find that it's like 2 p.m. and you haven't had lunch yet because you weren't hungry. Then you go to dinner, or you start intermittent fasting, where you realize that you don't even really need to eat breakfast because your body has got all these calories stored as fat that it's more than happy to use for fuel if you're not eating carbohydrates. So you don't have to eat breakfast because your body is fueling yourself anyway. So that's where keto and Atkins, when you accept, and it's a hard thing to accept that these foods we've been told will kill us will not, that's the result of a failed hypothesis. Then you go back to eating these foods, which is the foods our great-grandfathers ate, and their great-grandfathers ate, and they didn't worry about this. And then, you find that you don't crave the carbs, you're not hungry every 2 hours, you don't need to eat as soon as you wake up. You don't have to eat before you go to bed, and your body basically works. The technical term is you have fuel flexibility because now it's very easy to burn the fat. Um, and that's where if you do these experiments, it helps to do them right. So the place where it helps to read, say, one good book on this subject is to make sure that if you decide I'm going to test this diet, I'm going to test what it's like to not eat carbs. I give it a proper test so I don't do a shitty job of it and decide after a week I don't feel good, I'm tired, I'm going to go back to my donuts. Instead, you do it properly so you do feel good, you aren't tired, and you can go 2 or 3 months. And if you might think when you go in, look, I can't imagine a life without spaghetti, without pasta. I mean, I couldn't before I tried this. I know people, I don't understand them, but I know people who can't imagine life without potatoes. But if you're like 70 pounds overweight and you give up the pasta and the potatoes and the bread, and 2 months later, you've lost 50 pounds, which isn't unusual. You might decide that the pasta, the bread, and the potatoes aren't worth it, that you prefer being healthy than you do prefer, having French fries or having bread and toast and butter with your eggs in the morning, or wherever your carbs or your Wheaties. In my case, it was oatmeal. And the orange, you're not complying to a diet. You're living in a way that keeps you healthy. And most people would rather be healthy than not, even if it means not eating pasta or donuts, or maybe less so drinking beer.
Did you know a quick donut story, Greenie? And then Greenie, I think, wants to say something, but Phil Maffetone in his book in Fitness and Health, he wrote in the mid 90s, late 90s, and he had a one-page excerpt on donuts and why you should never eat donuts. And and I worked in a Wendy's when I grew up. So like I like to joke like I started as the pot washer in the back, and then I worked my way up to fry guy, so like out of the back kitchen up and cooking French fries. And like every 2 weeks or however long, but it just seemed like a unusually long amount of time where that grease would sit in the fryer. And you like, so what do you do with this stuff? Well, you like one night after closing, if you're really lucky, you get to empty the grease vats, pour it in these tubs, bring it outside and dump it in that big grease container that, like everybody sees in every fast food parking lot, at least they used to, right? The grease spills coming out from the dumpster. Like, what is that? That smells terrible, especially in the summer. Well, all that used grease gets in there. And so in his book, he explains, he's like, how they make donuts? Well, first of all, you have the highly refined processed carbohydrates that they're using, but the oils, and I don't think they're made this way anymore. So donut companies and don't come after me here, but they would take that oil and send it back to factories, and they would clean it. Like they would filter it like multiple times, pull out all the junk, and they would sell that back to shops that made donuts in other places because that oil was really light. So when you drop that donut in there, it would fluff up. And so that's why you get that nice, crispy, soft donut. But the carcinogens in one donut will stay in your system for up to like 3 months. So so I copied that page from his book, and then I blew it up, and then I posted it around our police department for people to read.
That must have won
Damn you,
friends.
Flannelly. Damn you. Why are you telling me I can't eat donuts? I'm sorry, Greenie, you had a piece of paper you were waving around at me there.
No. So Gary's not taking enough credit. In 2007, when he wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories, he wrote his top 10 list on page 454, and he knows I'm coming back to this. I just thought that was the most profound thing. He talks about dietary fat isn't the problem. The problem is the carbohydrates. The more easily digestible and refined the carbohydrates, the greater the effect on health, weight, and well-being. Sugars, high fructose corn syrup specifically, are particularly harmful. And then point number 4, he says, through their direct effect on insulin and blood sugar, refined carbohydrates, starches, and sugars are the dietary cause of coronary heart disease and diabetes. They are the most likely dietary causes of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and the other chronic diseases of civilization. Holy crap.
Okay, so let me.
And then point number 9, he says, the fewer carbohydrates we consume, the leaner we will be. 2007.
Yeah.
You were sounding just like Dr. Hallberg 8 years before her famous TED Talk, Reversing Type 2 Diabetes Starts with Ignoring the Guidelines. 8 years before. And I think that's pretty remarkable.
Well, thank you, Greenie. I do have to say about that list, my editor at Knopf, one of the best editors in the world, bar none. I mean, insisted I put that list in there. He said, come on, you've got to tell us what you believe after all this research. And I said, well, I'm not sure I'm right. And he said, you don't have to say you're right. You just have to say, this is what I believe after I've done all the research. So he gets the credit on some level for forcing me to step out of my comfort zone. I put a number of things together that nobody had put together before. So there had been people talking about the effect of insulin on weight gain, and Barry Sears being one of them, and then Mike and Mary Dan Eads. There had been people talking about how this idea of thinking about obesity as a calories in, calories out problem was absurd. I wasn't the first. There were people, very smart people, talking about how insulin and body weight would in turn feed back on how hungry we are and how much we eat. There were British nutritionists in the 50s, 60s, and 70s who were saying carbs are the problem, sugar and white flour. Because I'm a dogged investigator, because I hate writing, so I just keep researching as long as humanly possible, because as long as I'm researching, which I enjoy, I would be like a police detective who's never willing to go to the judge and say, let's try this guy. I still got.
I was going to say you would make a great cop, because we all love doing the fun stuff, but nobody actually wants to sit down and type the report afterwards.
It's a bitch, and the investigating is fun. I mean, putting these pieces. So I put all that together. I will take credit for that. When people would put and everything, all these different lines of thinking, like Jerry Reeven's metabolic syndrome, and the Brits, Peter Cleve and John Yudkin's, identifying sugar and refined flour as the problem, and all of it made the same argument. In physics, they would have said the evidence is robust. Or in a criminal trial, you'd say, look, we don't just have eyewitness testimony, which is nice, but we know eyewitnesses can deceive themselves. We got fingerprints, we got gunpowder residue, we got, footprints on the door he kicked in. We got evidence from all these different, we got DNA evidence, like we can convict. We got enough to convict. I had enough to convict because I had done homework that nobody else had ever done before, in part because the internet had come along and made it possible for me to do something. Suddenly you could locate all the sources, whereas you didn't have to live in a library for 20 years, but yeah, ultimately it comes down to, all these problems being caused by insulin resistance or whatever causes the insulin resistance. And then the obvious suspects are basically the sugars, things, sucrose, table sugar, and high fructose corn syrup, and then the refinement of carbs. But the problem is, once you're insulin resistant, it's not enough to just eat healthy. Well, like that healthy diet everyone's talking about, that's fine if you're healthy. You could probably get through your life if you're living on whole grains and fruits, vegetables, and legumes, and you'd probably be fine. But for those of us who become metabolically dysregulated, who start gaining weight and becoming obese, and our blood can't control our blood sugar and our blood pressure's out of control, for us, we need a higher dose of the intervention, which means avoiding those carbs entirely. And like I said, it's not like we don't have evidence to show that people get healthier. They just get healthier when they do
it. Stu Middleton, he's a SWAT trainer out on the East Coast. He said this once and it never left me, but he said, he had an old saying just for cops in a lot of different situations, but it's not a problem till it's a problem. And then it's a problem. So it's like...
Well, and that's the thing. And the people who are giving us advice are the ones for whom it's not a problem.
Right.
That's right.
Like now you have this world of bodybuilders out there who are telling us how to eat. And they seem to think that the only difference between us and them is that they bodybuild and we don't, or I don't, but not that our bodies are just different. Their bodies do something different with the foods they eat, among other things, build muscle easily. The steroids and other performance enhancing drugs probably don't hurt either there. But it's, you get advice from the healthy people. And what you need are getting advice from the people who used to be unhealthy and have fixed it, because they found at least a solution, if not the. So if you could find the cop who used to weigh 300 pounds and now weighs 180, high school wrestling weight, I want to know how that guy did it.
Yeah,
because that guy has found.
We'll show you the picture of Elvis.
Oh,
we got to show you the picture of Elvis.
Before and after? Which Elvis are we talking about?
John Eager.
John Eager.
He's a detective.
His back was killing him. He was 6'3", 6'5", 330. His back was killing him. When we tested him, he was markedly insulin resistant. He was pre-diabetic, markedly insulin. This is with permission. And so in 6 months on a low-carb approach, he loses 82 pounds, feels great, and his back is much better. You could see his posture straight. He could stand up straight. His posture was better. So he sends us, we'll send it to you. He sends us this picture of him in an Elvis costume for Halloween 1 year apart. And he lost this weight. He lost the 82 pounds in 6 months. It's a different guy. You can't recognize him. So now he's lost 100 pounds. And he's an incredible motivator for the West Lafayette Police Department. And Pat Flannelly is a big part of that story. And so is Sarah Hallberg.
And he still refuses to exercise. I can't get him to I'm trying to get him to work out. Just go for a walk, John. But he's like, nope.
The exercises.
Wait,
I am one of these people, and okay, I've been a jock my whole life. I played football and baseball in high school. I played football in college. I boxed poorly. Don't remember my last fight. Worked out probably on average 3 to 4 days a week my whole life. In LA, where I lived for like 20 years, there's nothing to do but exercise. That was like your social life. I think I've benefited enormously from doing it, but simultaneously, I think 90% of it is diet. I think because we know, look at what's happened to this guy, to Elvis, without exercise. Will he feel better later if he exercises? Maybe. The issue of the back would worry me because it's also easy to hurt your back when you're exercising. So it's sort of, there's this knee-jerk we got to work out and we got to eat. And then there are people like my buddy Peter Attia, who thinks exercising is now more important than diet, or at least that's what he writes. I don't know if that's what he thinks. We know that you could change people dramatically, like basically take an unhealthy, obese individual like Elvis and turn him into a healthy, lean individual just by changing the diet without any change in exercise. And we have no evidence that you could do that through physical activity. And the clinical trials where they do with physical activity and diet, the physical activity doesn't really add anything to the diet. Now, do I think it makes people healthier? I mean, I do it. I'm happier. It gets me out of the house, which is always a good thing. But the main thing is diet. You change your diet, you'll change your body. I mean, it's just clear. And the clinical trials that Sarah Hallberg ran for Virta showed that. It's one of the interesting things. Let me get you back to a story I wanted to tell from the diabetes book. So this kind of crystallized it for me. I was interviewing a guy, Russ Woolen, who had been a chef, and then he became a journalist. And he actually interviewed me for my sugar book. And while we were talking, it turned out that he had type 1 diabetes. So I said, look, when we're done I want to interview you later for my diabetes book. So he told me this story about getting diagnosed with type 1 when he was in his mid-30s. So type 1 is an insulin deficiency disease. You're going to have to take insulin one way or the other. Ideally, the less insulin, the better, but it's not how the ADA thinks about it. Anyway, he's telling me about being diagnosed. When you're diagnosed with this disease, you go from being somebody who's probably never thought about this in their entire life to suddenly getting, this is true of any significant disease diagnosis. Now you're confronted with the reality of what you've got, and you have to do this deep dive into this. And in type 1 diabetes, because we think we know how to handle it, the physician, an endocrinologist, diabetes educator will inform you. And so Russ is talking to these people, and they're saying, look, you've got this disorder of insulin deficiency. And so we're going to give you insulin, and that'll allow you to metabolize the carbohydrates that you're consuming. And then we're going to have you get half the calories that you eat from carbs, which will help balance out the insulin and keep your LDL cholesterol low. And Russ says, well, wait a minute. What you're telling me is that because I got this disease, carbohydrates are now toxic to me now, and insulin is the antidote. And you want me to eat the toxin and take the antidote. Why don't I just not eat the toxin? And the doctor looks at him like he's never thought about this before in his life, because he clearly hadn't. And then he said, well, if you don't eat the carbs, you'll be like on a diet and like Atkins, and nobody complies with that kind of diet. Nobody can adhere to that diet. And Russ says to him, I don't think I put this in the book. I don't remember. Well, wait a minute. If you're telling me to exercise and you expect me to spend an hour a day exercising, and I'm going to be like, got to get ready got to get my, into my gym clothes and drive for the gym. And then after the gym, I got to take a shower. And it's like, but nobody says nobody can comply with an exercise program, despite it eating up like an hour to an hour and a half of your life every day. Why are you telling me I can't comply to not eating carbohydrates? It's like, why even say that? Let me try it and see what happens. But these people have been so, they've grown up. I don't want to blame them, because these doctors mean well. I'm not, like I said, I don't blame this on the drug companies. I don't go there. The doctors mean well, but they've been taught this belief system that was never tested. And when we've tested the competing belief system, people get healthier. And they've created all these ways to think about it. So if I tell people nobody can comply to a diet, I somehow fulfilled my obligation to get them to do what the ADA or the AHA or the police association says they should do, as opposed to just saying, hey, that's an interesting idea. Instead of eating the toxin, taking the antidote, why don't you try not eating the toxin and let me know how that goes? Because if it works, I'm going to give that advice to my other patients.
Well, cops, doctors are a lot like cops in a way, right? Because cops do get pretty cynical. Yeah, that might be
Also,
the
if you
understatement of the day.
if you just follow guidelines, you can't get into too much trouble,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
even if you
Well,
know that what you're doing isn't going to work, but you do what you're told to do, nobody's going to get mad at you. You're not going to get reprimanded or suspended or, you know, is it really? But the world changes when people who say, hey, I know I'm supposed to do this, but I also know that's not going to work because it hadn't worked the last 20 times I did it and didn't get in trouble. How about if I try something new and see how that happens?
Yeah, and I think that's what makes people like Sarah so special. Dr. Sarah Hallberg, she running those clinical trials through her weight loss clinic, and just to I'll tell you a quick story, and that I alluded to earlier. But I was trying to put together this little program, a test pilot that I wanted to run in our police department, where we did lab testing and we did some like screening work to identify, what might be, inhibiting officer health and wellness, and then what are some pathways that we could to perform it. And I know you've given lectures for CrossFit before. I'm a big fan of those. I'm a former, technically, I guess I'm still an affiliate owner manager, but I owned a CrossFit gym very early on, and so one of my hypotheses was going to be I was going to run a small group of people through a clinic that does occupational care work, very similar to what Greeny's clinic does here in Indiana. And another, I was just going to run through a CrossFit gym and just like put 10 in one group, 10 in the other, and then do it for 6 months. And at the end of that 6 months, we'll turn around and look at where we are. Did you lose any weight? What did the BMI change? Fitness stuff, a few different indicators. Well, the one company didn't, the occupational care company, they didn't want to run labs at first. So I told them, I'm like, well, if you're not going to run labs, I'm not going to do this with you. I'll find somebody else. So they ultimately did run labs. And I had traveled to Phoenix for a conference. Everything was getting ready to start. And I had read this article in Police Chief magazine about resiliency as a path to wellness that Greeny and Steve Pitts had written. And at the time, I'd written an email to Steve Pitts, but he didn't respond to me. I gave him shit for that later, but turns out he had retired, and that's why he didn't respond to me. But I heard him on a podcast when I was on my way home from this conference, and he left his personal email. And you'll really appreciate this. So I sent him like I write this 2-page email about all the stuff that I'm working on. And we land in Indianapolis. The email hits the Wi-Fi and it sends. And so I get home at like 10 o'clock at night, and catching up with my wife, and I'm going through my emails, and I get this response from Steve Pitts. He said, "Hey, Chief, love to help out. Here's what I can do. I'm going to forward your email to Dr. Jim Greenwald. We call him Greeny, and Greeny loves to help cops, and I'll be in touch." So I was like, all right, cool. This is great. I'm making progress. Well, then it's 10 o'clock at night, 15 minutes later or so, I get an email from Greeny. "Hey, Chief, you cops are a sick bunch. You need all the help you can get." I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what he says. And he's like, "We'll be in touch. We'll help you." And I was like, oh, wow, this is really promising. Like now I've gotten responses from both. And then 15 minutes later, I get another response from Greeny. And so here's this doctor I've never met. I'm in Indiana. He's in Reno, Nevada. And he's like, "Hey, Chief, by the way," he's like, "if you've never watched this TED Talk before, I want you to watch this TED Talk. It's from a doctor that's right there in your own backyard." And he copies, as Greeny famously does, he copies everybody in on his emails in those chains. And one of the people he copies in is Dr. Sarah Hallberg. And I literally sat up in my bed. I was like, holy effing shit. My wife's like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I was like, "You'll never believe this." I was like, I go through that whole chain, and I'm like, and not only did a doctor that I've never met like actually responded to an email, he's responded to me twice in 15 minutes, and he copied Sarah Hallberg on this. And I'm like, he doesn't know that Sarah Hallberg is literally our backyard neighbor. And he's telling me to watch this TED Talk, and he includes her in. So I responded to the email and I was like, Greenie, like, you're never going to believe this, but Sarah Hallberg is literally my backyard neighbor. And so I was like, hi, Sarah. And anyway, I like to tell that story because it's, it's kind of one of those serendipitous moments. Greenie and I got connected, and Sarah was actually my wife's primary care physician before she got the opportunity to do this work with IU Health. And as she's written about, and I'm sure you're fully aware, just the opportunity for her to kind of take a step back, use her exercise science background to really do a deep dive into the research. That's when she was kind of like, well, this is really bizarre. And I'm learning all of these things that I didn't learn in medical school, like the standard of care doesn't seem like it's the right path to take. But we had a lot of conversations over the years, and one of her friends, Erica Uganskis, an internist, was a friend of ours also. And in 2013, I had brought Dr. Uganskis into our police department to do a wellness lecture, and she basically just said everything that we've been talking about today. Like, she works in internal medicine. She talked to our police officers about, here are the things that I treat every single day, and almost all of them are preventable. And here's how you can prevent that too. And this was, so this is over 10 years ago, 12, 13 years ago now. And so this is kind of, it's the evolution is, the information is progressing. It is getting out there, great thanks to people like you who've done the hard work, right? Because, people like me, it's easy to read your work and regurgitate it, but you're the one that's actually doing the work. So I do truly appreciate that work. And Sarah, one time Sarah, she brought her dogs over, and because I wanted to talk to her about some of the work that we were doing with this wellness project. And, she kind of opened up and told me a few things that I didn't realize that were going on. And there was a point in her life where, where she was actually like visibly shaken, a little bit scared about some of the threats, and the things that were being said to her, coming from some of these organizations that were really supposed to be there for the best interest of public health. And once she started coming out with this opinion that ran contrary to standard of care in your typical practice, it was like, she's like, sometimes I'm a little nervous to even look in my mailbox. Like, that's kind of how it was getting. And that, it really is kind of sad, because I think we all, well, I can't say we all, but it's when you do take a step back, when you do put on that investigator's cap and that detective mindset, you can see, look, there are things that we can easily do, some paths that we can clearly take that will work, but yet there are just forces that just seem to be out there that are working against us. And it's so easy to just keep planting those little seeds of doubt into people why they shouldn't do it. And then maybe because it's easier not to try, people sometimes don't try. But I don't know. I mean, do you get that same kind of blowback as well? I know you kind of alluded to it earlier when you were talking, like you lost a few friends and maybe not so popular. And I'm just kind of curious if some of those people have come back around now, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have gone at you, like I did.
Um, and has anyone? No, actually, the friends I lost stayed lost. That tends to happen in life. The but yeah, I've got. I mean, you get a lot of heat now because the message is when you're this. So I can sit here and say, look, the ADA got it wrong. The AHA, this obsession with cholesterol is crazy when you've got all these disorders of insulin resistance and carbohydrate intolerance. It's like, but what you're saying is basically everybody else got it wrong. Not just these associations, but the doctors and the professors and the heads of the associations. And, these really well-respected people who have risen to the top of their professions, and you're implying that you know better, that you, the journalist or the physician in Indiana, or the and nobody wants to hear that.
The knuckle drag.
I mean, it's
street
like if
cop.
I came up and told you, wrote a book, how you had fucked up policing, you wouldn't, even if I was completely 100% right, it would take you years to get around to reading it, right? Because you'd assume I'm wrong. I mean, I don't know I'm a journalist. What the hell do I know about policing? So it's a very natural response to just think this guy's a quack. As a funny story, my first book, we're going to be going for hours. My first book was about Nobel, nuclear, high energy physicist who, a guy won the Nobel Prize who had screwed up an experiment, discovered non-existent elementary particles. And I happened to be embedded with the physicists for 10 months while they figured out how they screwed up. And I thought I was going to write a book about a great breakthrough. And instead I wrote a book about like an expose about bad science and the politics and sociology of this crazy world of physics. And I did not make the Nobel laureate look that good. And a couple of years after my book came out, a physicist was a friend of mine, was at a conference, and he bumped into a guy who was in my book, who was like the right-hand man to this Nobel Prize winner, a guy named Dave Klein. And he said, Dave, what did you think about Taubes' book, Nobel Dreams? And Dave said, it's crap. I haven't read it. And that's a completely legitimate response. We all do that. It's crap. I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to waste my time reading that crap. He's a journalist. What does he know about what I do? Like, what is Sarah Hallberg, a doctor, in wherever the hell you live in Indiana? You're not at Harvard. You're not at Stanford. It's like, what does she know? So it's sort of, some people, they just respond negatively to the message that they're wrong, and somebody else who has no training whatsoever in the field thinks so. And part of my challenge as a journalist, I think of my challenge is I got to get people past the it's crap, I haven't read it stage. I'd be delighted if they say, look, I read that book, I studied it, it's crap, fine. But my job is to get them past the it's crap, I haven't read it stage, and I'm still struggling to do that job. The new challenges to it every year. Now it's the challenges, my message is an old message. We know what Taubes says, it's crap, I don't have to read it. But in getting them past it, it's just the world is full of people who are willing to tell you it's crap, I haven't read it. And then my most adamant assholic people on Twitter, the ones who have the most degrees and are most willing to say that I'm wrong and I'm an idiot, are the ones who refuse to read my writing because they know it's crap. And it's just,
love that word, by the way. I'm writing that down. Assholic.
Which, assholic?
I'm expanding my vocabulary.
And it just is, it's part of the job. If you're going to challenge conventional wisdom, people are going to get mad at you because you're not just challenging what they think, you're challenging who they are.
Yeah. And it's sad because the people that really need the help, it's easy to gravitate towards what you want to hear sometimes rather than what you need to hear. And that's really just kind of, and again, for all the thousands of people that came through our CrossFit gym and others that, that was just ultimately my message. It's like, you're here for a reason, because what you've done before isn't working or hasn't worked, or somebody's told you that this will work. So just give it 3 months. Don't worry about what you're saying.
To give it 3 months. You can get 3 months. It's like, look, 3 months, you can go back to your couch.
Yep.
3 months, you could go back to your orange juice and your pasta and your Wheaties and your donuts. Okay. But I am willing to bet that if you do this right for 3 months, you will not want to go back.
And we can document the progress now with the 7 lines of data, like Pat talks about, like like Ben Bickman's talking about, like Jim Otfos is talking about. We can document these rapid changes in insulin resistance, and it's right there in black and white. We can drop.
And I'm going to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I'm going to make life easier. It's there in your waist and your belt size. Okay.
Yeah.
It's there in the size of your pants. It's there in the fact that you're sleeping better, or you're not falling asleep in the middle of the afternoon, or, you know, so that you're right that the blood tests are vitally important.
But it's even more than that, Gary, because this occupation is under tremendous pressure. And there's this bi-directional link between insulin resistance and the depression. And it's stunning how quickly some of these officers in a place like New York City, that's under incredible stress, can change rapidly with a full court press and appropriate support. And that support started with you, continues with you. It continues with Sarah Hallberg and her work. It's greatly helped by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin and Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. The police are a unique group, 88% male. And the males become insulin resistant, often much more quickly than the females. The dietitians who talk to them are usually cute young females, so they can't relate to these males who are becoming insulin resistant. It's a unique group that appreciates you, Gary Taubes, every time you've talked to the police, especially at Quantico. Pat, you should have seen Gary Taubes at Quantico. We didn't even know if he was going to get through the two security gates, but he did somehow, and he knocked it out of the park. He even talked about exercise as a good thing. Surprised the hell out of me.
I believe exercise is a good thing, but if if they change.
Can't out exercise a bad diet, right?
You can't exercise. You can't outrun a bad diet. And if you fix the diet, you might want to run. I mean, it's the other thing. It's like if you got somebody who weighs 300 pounds and they want them to jog? That's insane.
That's insane.
If you get him down to 170, he's going to want to go jogging. He's going to want to show off his new physique also. But it's sort of at 300, fix the diet. When we get down to 170, we could think about,
Yeah,
one more Sarah Hallberg story.
Okay, so then I gotta go because I haven't eaten and it's 3:00 here.
So we follow up with Chief Flannelly. We test a bunch of his guys. Sarah's our consult. Steve Pitts and I travel to Lafayette. We meet these officers that we've tested at the training center. Chief Flannelly's there, Steve Pitts is there, Ian O'Shields, our trained trainer. And we're going through the officers, and we're in one really great interview. An officer has done really well, and there's a little knock on the door. Knock, knock, quiet. We open the door, and it's Sarah. Nina Hallberg said, Sarah will be remembered for how she could light up a room and the way her relentless, revved up dynamism dreamed 1,000 watts. Perfect.
Yeah, Sarah was special.
Sarah was special. So
well,
we're really glad you dedicated the book to her.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one of the great things about doing this, I do it. I got nothing else to do with my life. This how I make it. No, I love doing it, but you get to meet people like Sarah and you guys, and it's sort of it's fighting conventional wisdom can occasionally feel thankless, but you collect wonderful allies. And when you look at it over like a 20-year scale, talking about the getting support. When I first started writing about this 23 years ago, there may be half a dozen doctors in the country who prescribed low carb, high fat diets to their patients. And those were the guys who had written the diet books, like Mike Eads and Atkins and Barry Sears. He wasn't a doctor. Today there's, my estimate, 20, 30,000. So somebody wants to eat this way, all they have to do is Google low carb doctor, keto doctor in my neighborhood. We've started this sort of amazing revolution, and you guys are part of it, keeping it going. And Greenie, you've been indispensable. And Sarah was, one of these sort of nodes of brilliance that there are companies like Virta Health that are pursuing this now. And it's, again, there's always a pushback, like the policeman, you're going to talk to them and then they're going to go to their health people, and their health people are going to send them to a dietitian who's going to say, oh, no, 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 this is not the way to eat.
Yep. Fight it all the time.
Yeah, that's going to be a problem. And anyway, we are making progress. We are definitely making progress.
Well, I appreciate it. And I know you need to get going. Just a couple of closing thoughts. And again, Greenie mentioned Kevin Gilmartin, and, he's been such a powerful figure in the world of policing, bringing attention to the emotional well-being side. And even he changed his tune and has revised his book to really also talk about how nutrition and exercise and all of these things play together. Like, it takes a holistic approach to really complete, the whole officer. And Greenie mentioned it, right? We're in a time where we're overtasking and under-resourcing our police officers, and recruitment and retention is a huge issue. That puts a lot of pressure on the existing workforce. And then you start talking about emotional regulation and metabolic dysfunction. Well, the one thing that I hope everybody will take away from this article is, one, read Gary's books. If I were to say, if you've never read any of his books, start with Why We Get Fat, and then maybe go to The Case for Keto. And then I think some of the other ones, you can really start to geek out a little bit, and and be the benefactor of all of your very, very your hordes of research. I really, really do appreciate that. And I think if we can do those things, really just take it one step at a time, there is a path forward, and we can start improving our outlook, our disposition, by paying attention to yourself and being your own investigator, your own detective. Start figuring out what works for you and what doesn't. Eliminate the things that don't, build on the things that do, and you'll find that your outlook does change. You'll feel better. Your performance will be better. You'll be better for yourself, for your family, for your department, and in turn, your community. And I do think that we can turn around. So I as frustrated as I get at times, I do think it's a really exciting time because of the work that you've done, Gary and Greenie, and all of those that, that have really pioneered some critical research on helping us lay people understand the science behind what works, what doesn't work, building a great case, making a case to the prosecution as to why you should do this. And if for nothing else, right? If you're a cop and you're struggling with your weight, if you're struggling with your mental disposition and your outlook, what do you have to lose? If you've been doing the standard of care and the things that you've been traditionally told to do, and it's not working, what makes you think it's going to work tomorrow? Try something new. Don't be afraid. So reach out to us. We'll help in any way, right? We'll get Greenie. We'll send him out. We'll get you all tested. We'll get your labs done. And we'll get you on the path. So any closing words?
No, that pretty much wrapped it up. It's like, if it's not working, try something that might. Seems like reasonable advice for anyone. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Until the next time. We'll be 1042.